adoptee of the 60 Scoop. She's also the director of the 60 Scoop Legacy of Canada. And Catherine, I welcome you to come and share remarks at this time.
Bonjour, good morning. My name is Catherine LaGrange and I'm the director of the 60 Scoop Legacy of Canada. I'm also an adoptee from here in Manitoba. I was taken from birth from the hospital here in Winnipeg, and my family is from Crane River here in Manitoba. By the time I got enough information to find my birth family, it was too late. Both my parents died before I was 10 years old, so I'm still struggling to put the pieces of my birth story together. I do have 4 siblings, 3 of which I've never met, and 1 recently passed away of an overdose here in Winnipeg this summer. Throughout our work, we have held 19 healing gatherings across Western Canada, and one of the messages that we've heard from survivors is the need for a national inquiry. It's important that we dig into the 60 Scoop and the government policies of Indigenous child removal to determine how many children were taken, where they were taken to, and the long-term effects of trauma and permanent child removal. So over the summer, we asked some of the chiefs for their support, and we were grateful that both MKO and SCO passed resolutions to support our call for the national inquiry. We also have the support of Murray Sinclair, who unfortunately could not be here today, but we're grateful for everybody's support. I just wanted to say thank you to MKO and the Grand Chiefs for being here today, as well as everybody else for coming to the Human Rights Museum, which we thought was quite fitting for this press conference this morning. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Terry Starr. She is also another survivor of the 60 Scoop. Miigwech.
Good morning. Bonjour. My name is Terry Starr, and I'm a 60 Scoop survivor. I too was taken from my family at birth and was adopted when I was 3 months old. My story is one of a blessing because I was raised in a really good home. And many of the 60 Scoop survivors cannot not actually say that. And there has been a lot of trauma. And there was trauma in my childhood too, because I had dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes, and the rest of my family was light skin and hazel eyes and light hair. Going to school was hard too because I didn't fit in there as well. And when I found out I was a 60 Scoop, then you try to go back and learn your culture, but that's been taken away. And where do you start and where do you go? Who do you ask? And those questions still aren't answered. You try by yourself to learn your language, or you try and join classes and you still can't pronounce the words right. And you go to sweat lodges and some beautiful people. I've met amazing people in this journey of my life. And thanks to Catherine for organizing the organization 60 Scoop Survivors, where we can go and get answers and meet people. It's truly a blessing to have people. It's truly a blessing to have MKO step up. It's truly a blessing to have the Grand Chiefs here. We matter. People matter. Children matter. Please remember that. And thank you. I believe the national inquiry is very important. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to the 2 adoptees and survivors for sharing their remarks. One of the things that almost anyone would say to you is that probably every First Nations person is impacted by this issue and has family members who were adopted out of their families and communities. I'm now going to call on Grand Chief Jerry Daniels to come and share his remarks.
Thank you, Melanie. I want to thank Catherine LaGrange for her amazing work in advocating and bringing attention to this very important subject. I want to thank Grand Chief for being here as well and for his opening prayer. All those who are a part of ensuring that what has happened with the 60 Scoop is understood for the values it represents in the state of Canada and how we need to change that. I want to also thank Terry Starr for your words. Thank you so much. All the media that are here, those watching, I want to let you know that it's important for us to understand the kind of impact that 60 Scoop has on families, communities. Our relatives who are taken from us in this way are taking a very meaningful and important part of our community. They represent a great deal of gifts from our Creator. They represent love and nurturement that we share as family in our communities. And I have very many relatives who have been taken and spent their whole lives away from the community. And it's important for us to understand how 60 Scoop is a continuation of the residential school, how it is a part of disenfranchisement, and how it is part of the long-term strategic dispossession of First Nations identity and First Nations lands and the theft of our lands. It is all a part of the larger strategy and racial discrimination that happens, the institutionalized racial discrimination that happens in this country, which is still happening today in many aspects. When you think of the current child welfare system and the fractured system and inability for Ottawa to understand how important it is for us to get it right, and their bureaucrats to understand how important it is for us to get it right. I have very little confidence when I hear of the Prime Minister as well challenging our First Nations children. I think it's important for us to focus on where we are today and why the 60 Scoop is very important, and that the people who have survived the 60 Scoop and who were able to get home and the families who have had to go through that ordeal are compensated. And the impact that it has on our families and our communities is very well looked at so that these things do not happen again. And for those who really value community and family, would support, I think, a clear and comprehensive understanding of the sort of changes that need to be made, and that those who are impacted and had their lives shaped in a way that has not led to good outcomes be compensated and supported in reuniting with their families and also being able to be successful, vibrant citizens of our communities. So I want to thank you again for your work. And my hope is that we will have an inquiry of what happened with the 60 Scoop, and also that the settlements that are offered to our citizens are made and offered in a way that isn't looking for a savings strategy on behalf of Canada. I find that much of the bureaucratic thinking and theorizing is always focused on how can we save a dollar in our contribution or our compensation for First Nation citizens, and that is just unacceptable. I think all citizens, human beings, should be given equal right and equal representation and equal treatment by the state. And I think that would be a true reflection of what Canadians should be aspiring to. So with that, I thank you all for your time and hope that we continue to have a clear look at what happened and creating the change that's necessary for this country. Chimigoch.
Thank you, Grand Chief Jerry Daniels of the Southern Chiefs Organization. We will now call on MKO Grand Chief Garrison Setti as final speaker for today. Thank you.
Tansi, Miskat now, Anusagi Sigag, the piano mutamag, Ichigegon, and Naskuman. My name is Garrison Setti. I'm the Grand Chief of the MKO Kiwetnukimaganag organization, and I'm very honored to be here with Catherine and Terry for their stories that they have shared. And also want to thank my colleague, Grand Chief Daniels, for those very powerful words, invoking a lot of possible solutions for the people that are involved in the 60 scoops. And as MKO, we recognize the 60 scoop legacy of Canada for the persistent work you've done in holding the federal government to account. And we're here to support the 60 Scoops legacy for an inquiry into the 60 Scoop. This is federal legislation and policy that damaged a lot of young children. And some of them are still not recovered. Some of them are still not found today. And the trauma that they had to go through. And I think that an inquiry is needed, much similar to the residential school experience. This is a government-sanctioned policy that encouraged and promoted the ideas of taking Indigenous children, thinking that it was helping them, thinking that it would help them, but only to find out years later that it caused devastation and trauma to these children. And we need answers. The 60 Scoop survivors need answers. The parents need answers for what really happened, why it happened. And we're here as SCO and MKO to ensure that this does not continue to happen, because it's still happening. It is still happening to our children. And we cannot stand by any longer to allow policies that affect children, Indigenous children, from being removed from their communities, from their culture, from their language and their identity. This must stop, and it will stop. So we want to encourage the Canadian government to do a national inquiry, an inquiry for the 60 Scoop, because this is a policy that should never have happened to our people. And we need to examine and document the truths of survivors such as Terry and Catherine. Their stories need to be told, because a lot of them suffered starvation and hunger during these experiences. They suffered discrimination, not really knowing why. And also a lot of them were just used as commodities. It's hard to believe that there were commercials and advertisements for foster children to be adopted by anyone. There were commercials, government-approved commercials to advertise for the adoption of First Nation children. I always ask ourselves what kind of mentality goes into that kind of mindset to actually use our children as commodities. We need an inquiry. We support this inquiry. It must happen, should happen. Egusanik, and ask them it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grand Chief, for your remarks. So that concludes the end of our formal speakers program. So now I would accept questions from the media. There's quite a bit of you here, so I don't know if you want to come closer. And I don't know how we're going to address, we have 4 different people. So, just feel free to come closer and let me know if you have any questions for any of the speakers. Sure.
I would just like to ask how you begin starting a journey to look for your family or discover your lost heritage. Just to help the audience sort of understand how one begins that process and what
I'm going to just repeat the question in case the people online didn't hear you. So the question was about what is the process for survivors and adoptees? What process do they use to help find their families?
So for me, I was in a closed adoption, and it wasn't until 2015 that I got enough identifying information to begin a birth search. And all my life, I was told I was Métis, that I was mixed, and that is true. I am mixed, but it turns out that I actually have treaty to ebb and flow. And so that's what I was pursuing, that belonging to a nation, that reclamation of my culture. And so when I got enough identifying information from the post-adoption registry, then I was able to do a genealogy search and trace my family history back to ebb and flow and Crane River. But it's still a long journey. As I mentioned, I have 4 siblings, 3 of which I've never met. And some of them, well, 3 of them are reluctant to meet. And so that becomes very difficult when you're trying to reconnect with family. Both my parents are gone, my grandparents are gone. So trying to come back to the community has been very difficult. Do you want to say something?
For myself, I did find out that I'm Treaty 1 and I'm from Saugeen. And I was told I had been, because when I was trying to find out, go to sweat lodges and just see what that ceremonial life was like, I was told many times I actually sat in with family members and I've never known it. And I was at a dinner one time and I had smiled and the woman across the table said, "You're a star. Look at those dimples. We know where your family is." And I was just like, whoa, 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 because I was just starting that journey. So that threw me like right off because I wasn't sure if I was prepared, because there's that hurt. And I want to respect the family that raised me. And I don't want to disrespect them if I'm going and trying to find my family. But that piece is important to me as well. And I'm just waiting for the right time because I do not want to offend anybody in that search. But I do know that from both paths, right? And I'm just still in that neutral ground and finding information. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that Canadians have, in the last 2 years, really realized that a lot of the missing from the history lesson, if I can call it that, the way the government did it. What do you feel is really missing from the 60 Scoop that the APTN National inquiry could bring to the narrative of all Canadians that right now is not there?
I'm going to ask the survivors if they want to address the question, and I'll just sort of paraphrase what the question was, and it's from City News, and it's about, what would finding out more about the 60 Scoop add to the narrative of, what's going on with Indigenous people in Canada's history. So I'll ask the survivors if they want to address that first, and then I'll ask the Grand Chiefs if they'd like to answer that as well.
So for me, it's about accountability. The Canadian government has never been held accountable for the 60 Scoop, and certainly the provincial governments have never been held responsible. And so that's part of it. But also our parents and grandparents need to know that this was not their fault, that this was a result of their direct policies. This was not our fault. We did nothing wrong as children. And so that's what I really want to emphasize in this inquiry going forward.
I think in the inquiry, it's also important to know that we as children were taken. And it wasn't because our parents didn't love us. I was told that was one of the reasons why I was scooped, is because my parents didn't love me, or that community didn't love me. But it was due to a policy and other people's hand that was able to scoop the children. Those questions need to be asked. Why? Why was that all right? Why was it okay? Why was it important not to care? We matter. All children matter. All people matter. It needs to be dug into.
Thank you for the question. I think that when you're comparing 60 Scoop specifically to Every Child Matters and what happened in the residential school, we want to know the transition from sort of the policy side within government, the government officials, and the language that was used when they were speaking about the 60 Scoop, and how that has shifted even more broadly to what's happening now with the 11,000 children who are in care here in Manitoba. And I think that, when you hear of the advertisements, the companies that were behind the advertisements and the people who were a part of making the Legacy Scoop possible, the countries outside of Canada that were a part of that. It's very important to know where all our children went, and I wouldn't say that all of them have been able to be returned, and so it's important that Canada understands what happened to every single one of the children that were impacted by this. And until that's done, I think we haven't really done justice for Canadians and for all the children that were taken away from their homes.
I think it's apparent that there was an atrocity committed through legislation and policy. And we must re-examine ourselves as Canadians and Manitobans to know the history of these policies and the people that push them. And Canada as a state is responsible, and they must be held accountable. And the people that were behind this policy are responsible for trauma, hurt, pain to children. And Canada must own up to that. That's why there should be an inquiry. We must really go through a thorough examination of how this happened, and Canadians need to know. That's why I support this, because they're only finding out about residential schools now. After 150 years of the history of the state, they're only finding out about what really happened in these schools. And in the 60 Scoop, there's a lot of things that happened that Canadians need to know that their government, their state, promoted and sanctioned and deemed that this was the right thing to do. But we now know it was never the right thing to do. And that's why I believe that a healing process needs to be developed for the 60 Scoop survivors as well. There's still a lot of trauma and they need to heal. And the government is responsible for providing that process.
I would also like to know why did you decide to ask for this party right now? Is it because we all learn a lot about the residential school this summer? Is it this specific time frame the best for you to ask for the inquiry?
I'm just going to repeat the question. Just for our viewers online, we have a question from CBC Radio Canada. And the question is, why are we calling for a national inquiry now? So I'm not sure who would like to answer that.
I think you can probably say that that's part of it, but I think also many of us, I think, are frustrated with the current settlement process as well. And I think that Canada needs to be reminded that there's a lot at stake here in terms of the people who have experienced a great deal of suffering as a result of the legacy of the 60 Scoop. And we also want to broaden sort of the understanding of Canada's policy outside of the residential schools, because Legacy Scoop was happening as another layer to what was happening in residential schools. Residential schools were happening, and many of the children, this goes back many decades now, a whole generation, where children were being abused in these homes, families were being fractured. We were being excluded from the economy. Our agricultural sector was being excluded from the markets, all at the same time. All kinds of new sort of addictive substances were being introduced to our communities over this time. And so our communities were really in a state of crisis, which continues today. And Canada needs to understand the overlapping impact that 60 Scoop has made. You know, it's not that the residential schools were happening in isolation. While the children were getting taken into residential schools or going to these schools, they were also being taken from their families and being sent off. And that adds another layer, I think, to the understanding of what happened with our missing children who never made it home. You know, there are children who still never made it home in the 60 Scoop. And that's what I think is important for us to sort of add to the conversation and the understanding.
Truth and reconciliation involves truth. And this is one of those truths that need to be told. If Canada is to reconcile with Indigenous people when it comes to residential school, but also the 60s Scoop, that truth has to be told. And I've heard many stories from 60 Scoops survivors. Some of them were celebrities that told their story of how they were moved into the States and to suffer sexual abuse at the hands of the family members that they were adopted into. And a lot of them experienced racism throughout their lives because of their skin, not knowing why, that they belonged to a family that were different. That's traumatizing, and it is still traumatizing. And some of them, after they reached the age of 18, when no longer funding was no longer available to keep, they were booted out onto the street, and a lot of them ended up on the street. Some of them in the streets of Winnipeg. And those truths need to be told. Those stories need to be told, and they can only be told by 60 Scoop survivors. That's why an inquiry is essential to get at these truths, because there's no reconciliation without the truth. And that truth is one of those things that we need to hear from those survivors. It must happen, and it must happen now.
This is a national issue here. Are you planning to ask other First Nation organizations to join you in this goal?
So the question was whether we would be asking other First Nations organizations to join us in this call for a national inquiry, and the answer is yes, we will. Are there other questions from the media?
I just sort of an expansion on that. What are the next steps for this to federal?
Okay, so the question from the Winnipeg Free Press is what steps do we need to take next to bring this to the national level?
Thanks for the question. What we're hoping for is that the Trudeau government will meet with us to form a survivor steering committee, and that committee would direct this inquiry. We cannot have government-run inquiries any longer. It has to be survivor-led. And so that's our hope over the next while. And we've invited Minister Bennett, who is no longer Cernak minister, to meet with us many, many times, and she has never responded to us. So our hope is that we'll begin to engage with the Trudeau government going forward.
I think that me and Grand Chief Daniels are committed to support this inquiry, and we will do our utmost to ensure that it goes nationally, working with our national colleagues, and ensure that this is advocated in a way that will cause all of Canadians to know about it. So we're really supporting this, and our teams are getting ready to mobilize so to make sure that this warrants national attention.
I just had a text from somebody who works with me. I don't know if she's a 60 Scoop survivor, but what she wanted you to know today is that there was compensation for the 60 Scoop survivors. However, many of them were not able to apply for it given the policies and deadlines. And she would like that to be revisited. And, you know, I just want to add on a personal level, I know a lot of the people who were working on this behind the scenes. This was very emotional for us because, like I said, many of us are impacted by the 60 Scoop. My own mother was adopted out to a family in Oregon, USA. And she was adopted out with her 3 siblings, and I know where one of those siblings is. So I have one aunt that I know where she is. You know, a lot of our First Nations families, they always joke about how many cousins we have and everything. And for me, I actually don't know where my cousins are. I've met a couple of them now, but that's something that, you know, I really wish I had a network of cousins and aunties, but I believe they're in the United States, many of them. So there's no system in place to help me find them or for them to find me. So the burden is really on the survivors to go and find their families. And I don't really think that's right.
That's right.
Are there other questions from media? I know this is a lot of information to take in. So I just want to thank all of you for coming out today and, you know, listening to us and helping us to share our truths. And if there's any final remarks from any of the speakers, now's your chance.
I just wanted to add, Grand Chief Daniels touched on it, but the settlement that happened that was announced in 2017, we are still waiting for that healing foundation to be formed. They are still not operational. And that's why we formed the 60 Scoop Legacy of Canada, because we knew that it was going to be some time before healing resources were made available to us. But also we recognize that many people missed the deadline for that settlement. And so we're hoping that the Trudeau government will look at that, reopening that deadline, as long as it doesn't stall the progress that's in motion now. There's still 9,000 claims outstanding in that settlement. It's unacceptable. So my hope is that they'll engage with us about that as well.
Thank you to everyone who attended and who tuned in online. And this concludes our press conference on the 60 Scoop. Thank you.